governor Felix. First, Paul is put on trial, verses 1 through 9. Second, Paul's defense, verses 10 through 21. Third, the governor puts Paul in prison, verses 22 through 23. Fourth, Paul witnesses to the governor, verses 24 through 27. Read verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Paul left Jerusalem and arrived in Caesarea. Through the protection of the Roman soldiers, Paul safely came before the governor. Here it says 5 days later. This is 5 days after Paul arrived in Caesarea. At that time, the high priest Ananias and a lawyer named Tertullus came. Tertullus was an expert in the law. They came to accuse Paul before the governor. Verses 2 through 3. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. The governor called Paul for the trial. Tertullus, the lawyer, spoke first. When we look at what Tertullus said, he tried to gain the favor of the governor. He wanted to get a favorable outcome from the governor. He praised the governor. Then he thanked him, saying that it was because of the governor that his people enjoyed peace through reforms in the nation. He flattered the governor. However, when Paul spoke next, he spoke the truth just as it was. Verse 4. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. Paul said that he would speak briefly. Verses 5 through 6. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. Tertullus accused Paul. Tertullus presented Paul as a criminal and instigator of trouble. He made Paul out to be a rebel. He also called him a leader of heresy. He also said that Paul stirred up riots among the Jews. He said that Paul was a criminal who stirred up trouble among the people. He also said that Paul had defiled the temple. Therefore, Paul was a person who could never be accepted by the Jews. Verses 7 through 8. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. Tertullus said that the governor would be able to confirm the truth about all these charges if he examined Paul himself. Verse 9. The Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. The other Jews who came with Tertullus joined and agreed with these charges. Verse 10. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Then the governor gave Paul the opportunity to defend himself. Paul got the opportunity to share the gospel. In this way, Paul was able to share the gospel before the governor. Afterwards, he was able to share the gospel with the king as well. Before this, Paul was able to share the gospel before a large crowd of people. He also preached about Jesus before the Sanhedrin and all the religious leaders. Here, Paul said, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation. He said that he would gladly make my defense. Paul did not flatter the governor. He spoke plainly just as things were. He spoke with his conscience. When we speak from a clear conscience, God will also help us. Verses 11 through 12. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. Here, Paul made his defense. Paul said that he went up to Jerusalem to worship 12 days ago. The accusers, then, did not find him arguing with anyone or stirring up a riot in the synagogues. Paul said that he was not guilty of instigating a riot. He also said that he never defiled the temple. We will continue the lecture with chapter 24, verse 13. Verse 13. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. Here, Paul said that he was not guilty of all the claims of his accusers. He also said that they had no proof. According to Roman laws, there needed to be definite proof in order to pronounce a person guilty. Therefore, Paul insisted that Ananias and Tertullus had no evidence of him doing wrong. Verses 14 through 16. However, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that agrees with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. Paul continued to give his defense. Paul provided solid background to his beliefs. First, he said he believed in the God of his fathers. Second, he believed in what is written in the law and the prophets. Third, he had hope in God. Fourth, he believed in the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. Fifth, he always acted with a clear conscience with respect to his faith. In this way, Paul said that he believed in Jesus the Christ that the Jews were waiting for. He also believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. He said that what the Jews believed and what he believed were one and the same. Therefore, everyone must believe in Jesus. Paul always acted and testified by his conscience. Verses 17 through 19. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Paul continued to testify. He said that he came to Jerusalem to bring his people gifts. He emphasized the fact that he had come to offer assistance to his people. He was not a person who was a threat to his people, but rather he was a person who wanted to help his people. He also told them that he was ceremonially clean. Paul was not a defiler of the temple, and he pursued purity. Yet it was the Jews from Asia who had falsely accused Paul. Also, Paul had never started a riot. Verses 20 through 21. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Paul said that he had said nothing wrong when he gave his defense before the Sanhedrin. In chapter 23, Paul was questioned by the Sanhedrin. Paul said that he was on trial for testifying to the resurrection of the dead. Even the Jews hoped in the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, Paul was saying that he had done nothing wrong. Verses 22 through 23. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. Governor Felix knew after the trial that Paul was not guilty of any crimes. Because Paul was innocent, Felix should have freed Paul. Yet Felix did not free him. The governor knew that Paul was innocent and yet did not free him. he said that he would end the trial when the commander came. Then he ordered the guard to give some freedom to Paul. Here the governor knew what the right thing to do was and yet did not carry it out. The reason why he did not free Paul was to gain the favor of the Jews. We must not seek to please people, but do what is right in God's eyes. Verse 24. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. This is recorded in Acts chapter 12, verse 1. She was also the sister of Agrippa II. Acts chapter 23, verse 13. Chapter 26, verse 1. Drusilla was Felix's close companion. Felix called Paul to entertain her. Felix also wanted to know the way to faith. Verse 25. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." Paul told the governor about faith. He taught about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. The righteousness is the righteousness we receive when we believe in Jesus. We become righteous when we believe in Jesus. Then we receive salvation. Next, Paul taught about self-control. Those who believe in Jesus must practice self-control. We must not follow the temptations of materialism, lust, or selfish desires. We must cut off everything that is wrong. This is what it means to have self-control. Governor Felix was living as the king of the world without any self-control. Therefore, Paul taught him about self-control. Then he taught about the judgment. There is judgment at the end of life. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27. Everyone will stand before God for judgment after they die. Those who believe in Jesus will be saved. Those who did not believe will be thrown into the eternal fire of hell. God is the God of love and justice. After hearing this message, Felix began to fear. Yet he did not accept the message. He lost the chance to be saved. He should have repented and asked how he could be saved. However, he did not act with faith, and he lost his chance to be saved. When we are given the chance to believe, we must believe. When we must repent, we must do so right away. That is how we can participate in God's salvation. Opportunities do not always come our way. Verse 26. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. The governor hoped to receive a bribe from Paul. This was a wrongful action of a politician. Verse 27. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. After 2 years, a new governor, Festus, was appointed. Felix was succeeded by Festus. Felix left Paul in prison for 2 years. The governor wanted to do a favor for the Jews. The governor sacrificed Paul. In the same way, the politicians of the world do not care about the worth of individuals. They sacrifice people in order to gain more authority. However, Paul spread the gospel diligently to those who visited in the 2 years. He cooperated in this way and did good. The gospel was spread. We will continue the lecture with chapter 25. The title of chapter 25 is Governor Festus. First, the charges of the Jews, verses 1 through 8. Second, Paul appeals to Caesar, verses 9 through 12. Third, the conversation between the governor and the king, verses 13 through 22. Fourth, the governor explains the reason for convening the court, verses 23 through 27. Read verses 1 through 3. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus became the governor of Judah. 3 days later, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. In Jerusalem was the high priest and people of high positions from among the Jews. The official residence of the governor was located in Caesarea. Paul was locked up in the prison in Caesarea. The Jews requested of the governor to send Paul to Jerusalem. Why did they do this? They were planning to kill Paul as he came from Caesarea to Jerusalem. 2 years earlier, they made a similar plan by taking an oath. Verses 4 through 5. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there, if he has done anything wrong. Festus denied the Jews' request to bring Paul down to Jerusalem. This was God's work in moving the heart of the governor. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 2. God protected Paul. Verses 6 through 7. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him which they could not prove. Festus finished his business in Jerusalem and came back to Caesarea. The Jewish leaders came down to Caesarea again. Then they accused Paul. Paul again stood in court. Then they listened to Paul's defense again. Verse 8. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Paul gave his testimony. He insisted that he did nothing wrong against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. He spoke boldly with a clear conscience. Verse 9. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Festus knew that Paul was innocent. However, he was afraid to let Paul go because he was afraid to lose the sentiment of the Jews. In order to please the Jews, he asked if Paul would be willing to go to Jerusalem to stand trial. In this way, the governor followed the sentiment of the public. Matthew chapter 11, verse 17. The governor of the people threw away justice. Verses 10 through 11. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Paul said that he was standing in Caesar's court. The governor was Caesar's representative. Therefore, standing trial before the governor was the same as standing trial before Caesar. Paul again said that he had done nothing wrong against the Jews. Paul said that if he had done anything deserving of death, he should die. However, Paul was not guilty of such crimes. That is why Paul appealed to Caesar. It appeared to Paul that Festus would not set him free. This was because this governor thought only about the sentiment of the people. Therefore, to Paul, it was better to appeal to Caesar. Paul used his rights as a Roman citizen. The Lord commanded him to preach the gospel in Rome. Acts chapter 23, verse 11. Paul wanted to go to Rome in obedience to the Lord's command. Hence, Paul used his rights as a Roman citizen for the Lord. Paul was not suing anyone. He was the victim who needed a just trial. Chapter 28, verses 17 and 18. In this way, Paul planned to go to Rome according to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Paul knew that God was leading him through such circumstances. Verse 12. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go." Festus conferred with his council. Because Paul had appeared to Caesar, Festus decided to send him. Verse 13. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice visited. King Agrippa was the son of Agrippa I. Hence, he is also known as King Agrippa II. Bernice was Agrippa's sister. She was a woman of bad character. Verses 14 through 19. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. Festus spoke to Agrippa. Felix, the previous governor, had Paul locked up in prison. When I went to Jerusalem, the Jews brought charges against him. The plaintiff accused the defendant. Yet the Roman law gave the right for a defendant to defend himself against the charges. Therefore, I gave Paul this opportunity. However, Paul preached his faith and testified to a man named Jesus. Paul did not commit any crimes. In this way, Paul did no wrong according to the laws of the world. The Jews accused Paul according to their religious convictions. Verses 20 through 21. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. He said that Paul did not want to go to Jerusalem to be put on trial. Paul appeared to Caesar for his trial. Hence, the governor decided to send Paul away to Caesar. Verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. King Agrippa said that he wanted to hear Paul himself. Then Festus told him that he could hear him tomorrow. Verse 23. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. The next day, many people gathered for another trial. King Agrippa and Bernice were also present. There were also high-ranking military officers and prominent men of the city. The governor ordered that Paul be brought in. Then Paul stood trial in their midst. Verses 24 through 25. Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome." Festus spoke before all the people and said that he found nothing wrong with Paul. He said that nothing was found deserving of death. However, because Paul had appealed to Caesar, the governor had to let him go. Verses 26 through 27. But I have nothing definite to write to His Majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. Before sending a prisoner to the emperor, there needed to be a reason. There had to be a crime that the prisoner committed. There also needed to be some kind of evidence to show the emperor. However, Festus still did not know what Paul was guilty of. That is why he put Paul in front of Agrippa and all the men of the city to find out. Paul was brought out especially for Agrippa. Festus hoped to get some information to explain to the emperor why Paul was being sent. In chapter 26, Paul again will make his defense. Paul would be tried before the governor, the king, the officers, and leaders. Paul would testify about Jesus once again. Here we will conclude the 18th lecture on Acts. Thank you.